A while ago, a commenter under my Elden Ring video dared to dream of a perfect survival horror game. It would be developed by From Software and directed by renowned auteur Hidetaka Miyazaki, because, as they said, FromSoft used to make horror games. I assume they meant the 2004 cult hit Kuon, which is something of a darling here in the YouTube essay space. But Miyazaki had nothing to do with it, and frankly, as cool as it would be, I doubt they'll ever revisit it. The good news, though, is that FromSoft never stopped making horror games. In fact, Miyazaki directed one as recently as 2015. It was a little PS4 exclusive with a rabidly devoted following, and even though it was a survival horror game, it wasn't the slower, traditional kind that this particular commenter was looking for. You might have heard of it, actually. It was called Bloodborne. Now, that might be a bit of a contentious statement. I realize that most of the Bloodborne discourse that I see and hear and participate in revolves around how the game stacks up to its cousins in the FromSoft catalog. People place it into the action RPG box, or the action RPG with horror elements box if they're feeling saucy, and they never think about its genre again. But the game doesn't have to fit into just one box, right? It doesn't have to exist as just a bunch of disembodied, Souls-like mechanics in a From Software vacuum. And to treat it like it does would limit your understanding of a game that I'm sure you love. Bloodborne emerged from a vast, deep ocean of horror media that bestows new context and meaning to its FromSoft standard mechanics. So today, I want to tilt at some windmills for a bit and argue that those systems, wrapped in the visual and thematic language of horror media, make for one of the greatest survival horror experiences of all time. In discussions of survival horror, you often hear that what sets the genre apart from the rest is its willingness to curtail player agency. What that means, 9 times out of 10, is survival horror games disempower the player in combat, sometimes entirely. There's some obvious truth to this, right? When it comes to the canonized survival horror games, your character controls like a tank that's been dredged out of a frozen swamp. You've got to stand still to shoot, and even then, enemies have such large health pools that shooting usually feels like a waste of your precious ammo. 'Cause that's the other thing. Survival horror games typically restrict your access to resources like healing items, ammo, and inventory space, especially early on. When you have to fight from a vulnerable position and you don't know when you'll find the next cache of supplies, the optimal playstyle usually feels like a lot of cautious exploration punctuated by mad scrambles for safety as you flee from monsters instead of fight them. But the survival horror player's struggle to directly confront every monster might not have been a desired design decision, at least not at first. Developers in the 90s and early aughts simply didn't have the technology to fit wide-open worlds, intelligent enemy AI, complex puzzles, and action-packed combat into one cohesive game. They only had so many megabytes of CD space and RAM to play around with, to say nothing of the pressure created by budgets and deadlines. Basically, as Lee Alexander noted, early titles in the genre would have had to put combat in the back seat to focus on the horror. So it makes sense that as technology improved and player expectations rose alongside developer ambitions, that survival horror's historically weak combat would come to the fore and evolve with time. Enter Resident Evil 4. Hold on, that was missing some juice. Let me try that again. Enter
Resident Evil 4.
Oh yeah, fucking nailed it. Anyway, the 2005 installment of the series that coined the term survival horror was much more fast-paced and combat-oriented than any Resident Evil title up to that point. As Leon Kennedy, a himbo so badass that he mainly gets around by jumping out of windows, you had an arsenal of weapons and consumable items to help you mow down entire villages of infected cultists. This was still a survival horror game, though. Players had to deal with a wealth of enemies and a dearth of resources. But even though you had to stand still to shoot, the gunplay felt empowering. By shooting projectiles out of the air and blowing up sticks of dynamite in your enemy's hands, you could get creative with your approach. In fact, weapons became your main way of interacting with Resident Evil 4's world. Leon could use his knife to crack open crates and use his guns to solve puzzles and explore his surroundings, much in the same way a toddler explores the world by shoving everything into their mouth. Resident Evil 4 still finds its way to the top of best survival horror games of all time lists. And for one market-chasing reason or another, most big-budget survival horror games released in the years since have followed in Resident Evil 4's wake. They're more action-oriented and dwell more on what film scholar Irene Chien calls the reflex-activating power of fear. In other words, survival horror games evolved in 2005. Combat no longer had to take a back seat, the fight could be the fright. And it's here that I want to turn to Bloodborne. This is a game that gives you the freedom to choose between a variety of weapons, armor, and consumable items to express yourself in fluid, hyper-aggressive combat. Garnished with hit stop, geysers of blood, and a parry attack animation that goes unreasonably hard, the combat in Bloodborne just makes you feel like a suave Victorian killing machine. It's badass, and I'll admit, it seems to fly in the face of traditional survival horror design. As it turns out, though, the game is all about managing scarce resources, especially in the early game. You've got all the FromSoft standard resources to watch out for, HP, stamina, weapon durability, but where Bloodborne strays from the pack is in its handling of healing items and ammo. Unlike the Estus flasks and spell charges of Dark Souls, let's say, blood vials and quicksilver bullets don't replenish every time you rest. If you want more, you have to scrounge them up yourself. Well, you can find a few of each scattered around Yharnam. Killing for them, or for the Blood Echoes to buy them, is far and away the most reliable way to top off your supplies. As Bloodborne's primary currency, Blood Echoes are arguably the most important resource in the game. You can use them to buy consumables, of course, but also to buy weapons, armor, gear upgrades, and even level ups. The more Blood Echoes you spend, the higher your margin of error, your chance of survival, becomes. When you die, though, your Blood Echoes will be absorbed by the enemy that killed you or dropped as a collectible near where you died. So unless you can kill that threat and survive, a very tough enemy is going to hold your access to health, ammo, money, and XP hostage. Unlike traditional survival horror games, Bloodborne doesn't let you keep a save file to fall back on in case you lose all your Blood Echoes and healing items and ammo. They could disappear forever if you botch a particularly difficult boss fight and leave you feeling desperate. The game's unique rally mechanic, though, makes it possible to bounce back from such a dreadful position. When you're hit by an attack, your HP doesn't disappear instantaneously like in other FromSoft games. Instead, it lingers on your health bar for a few seconds and recovers a little bit with each successful strike. And if you manage to parry an enemy, a gambit that requires precise timing and at least one quicksilver bullet to pull off, the visceral attack you might land on them will recover all of that lingering health. In an interview for Bloodborne's Collector's Edition guide, Miyazaki states that this system changes the concept of your defense to something proactive, in order to encourage the sense that you're fighting a life and death struggle. You're meant to throw yourself recklessly into a fight without a shield to fall back on or a way to flee. In other words, the rally mechanic, arguably the defining feature of Bloodborne's combat, is meant to make every fight feel like a fight for your survival. A feeling that's compounded, by the way, by the game's out-of-this-fucking-world enemy design. The fodder enemies and mini-bosses are all viscerally rendered, with bloody humanoid features painfully stretched out over inhuman forms. And like any other FromSoft game, Bloodborne's bosses form the cream of its enemy design crop. Terrifying beasts, demented former hunters, and psyche-shattering gods from the deepest reaches of the cosmos. They've all got much larger health pools than comparable bosses in FromSoft's other Souls-like games, so even at maximum aggression, you're locking horns with horrors for several minutes at a time. Unlike in similar FromSoft games, combat in Bloodborne is not portrayed as glorious or mythical or redeeming in any way. You're not fighting tragic monarchs or fallen heroes. No, you're fighting blood-drunk beasts and incomprehensible violations of the natural order, and it's messy and terrifying and visceral. The subtle changes Bloodborne makes to FromSoft's proprietary combat system turns the game into a gore-soaked fight for your life. All the horrific aspects of survival horror, the deliberate movement, the resource management, and the reflex-activating power of fear, get focused into single, perfect moments of aggressive agency. In Bloodborne, the fight is the fright. Survival horror games don't just rely on combat to curtail player agency, though. In fact, they constantly chip away at your sense of control through far more subtle means. Now, this might come as a shock to you, but video games are primarily a visual medium. And unlike a film or a play, they're interactive. I think it's safe to say that, by now, most popular games take this interactivity to the extreme, granting the player a full 360-degree view of vast landscapes built for free-roaming exploration. Long before then, though, according to Irene Chien, traditional survival horror games withheld that freedom from players, and instead borrowed from the more culturally ingrained visual language of horror cinema to build tension. Many relayed their game worlds through a fixed camera perspective, limiting a player's view to only a few pre-selected angles. Walking through fixed camera spaces creates an effect not unlike a horror movie montage. Each cut, from one static, claustrophobic angle of a dark room to another, creates new, unseen corners in your mind, filled with danger. Even those games that relinquished some control of the camera to the player found other ways to obliterate their horizons, either through palpable fog and darkness or through subtle camera readjustments. The games further erode any sense of agency by frequently jumping in and out of cutscenes. In his essay, Storytelling in Survival Horror Video Games, Ewan Kirkland goes so far as to claim that this tendency is a move specific to survival horror games. Being repeatedly put into and taken out of the driver's seat makes the player feel as though they're, in his words, being subjected to the influence of higher occult powers. The survival horror designer has laid out a frightening path for you, and you must follow it. Like a good horror movie, the effectiveness of a survival horror game rides more on how it denies you a glimpse of what goes bump in the night. Despite Bloodborne's sparing use of cutscenes, its free-flowing camera, and its relatively unobscured world, it still excels at this principle. The game's cutscenes are minimal in number and maximal in impact. Take its opening cutscene. The camera shares your perspective as you're strapped to a table in what looks, in the dim candlelight, like a haunted medical torture chamber. A blood-soaked old stranger leans in to ramble at you before knocking you out to complete a mysterious blood transfusion. You soon awaken and watch, unable to move, as a rotting, dead-eyed werewolf emerges from a pool of blood. It lurches uncomfortably close to your face and extends a wicked claw when suddenly it erupts into flames. In the uneasy silence that follows, you watch, helplessly, as ghastly little creatures start to crawl up your paralyzed body and envelop your face. The camera never looks away, never pulls back from that first-person perspective. The game just starts after that, and you're left with the lingering feeling that your agency was not only curbed, but violated. The camera gets untethered from our perspective in the next cutscene, dollying to the left as Father Gascoigne stands at the back of the frame, mindlessly hacking away at something. The camera then cuts closer, trying to follow his movements, but it's shakier now, perhaps uncertain or fearful. He's chopping up a dead body with his hunter's axe, a weapon we might have chosen as our own, until the head, long dead, slides off. As he turns to look at us, the camera again cuts closer and holds on his face as he snarls like a beast. This cutscene and the ensuing fight serve as dark portents of our future. If we keep on the hunter's path, our humanity will slip away and will lose control of the beast within. Yahar'gul's intro cutscene has us gagged, bound, stuffed into a sack, and deposited into a moldering prison cell, again from an uncomfortably intimate first-person view. Vicar Amelia's cutscene is as classic horror movie as it gets, using shadows and blood splatter cutaways to let us fill in the gruesome details of her transformation. Micolash's cutscene is shot entirely with Dutch angles, suggesting the utter madness wrought by the pursuit of cosmic truths. Time and time again, Bloodborne's cutscenes use the techniques of horror cinema to build an atmosphere of dread. Although Bloodborne hands you the reins to the camera, it still hides a lot from you. Much of the game's play space is predictably spooky. Dark, narrow hallways, dense, decaying woods, cluttered and chaotic city streets. In Yharnam, horrid beasts lie in wait beyond every darkened doorframe and lurk in every fog cloud. But because of how Bloodborne hides its bosses from you, its open areas are even more frightening. As you traverse a given level in one of FromSoft's other Souls-likes for the first time, you might come across a big, door-shaped wall of fog. You would have been taught from the tutorial that when you traverse this fog, you're very likely going to fight a boss. Armed with this knowledge, you're allowed to pause and make a decision. Walk right up and throw down, or warp back to a bonfire and replenish yourself. Bloodborne never gives you the chance. The Nightmare Fog, as it's called in this game, won't appear until you've fought a given boss at least once. You never know you're going to walk into a boss arena until its inhabitant is already lunging at you. Now, if you've already played Bloodborne or any of the other FromSoft games before, you're gonna see these boss arenas coming from a mile away. Still, you'll get ganked by some of these bosses on your first playthrough. It's gonna catch you off guard, and plant potential threats into every single open area you find from then on. On top of Bloodborne's mechanical tricks, seeing, or rather unseeing, holds a lot of narrative weight. One of the game's coolest, creepiest mechanics is insight, a measure of your character's understanding of Eldritch truths. When you have 0 insight, for example, you understand nothing, and the Hunter's Dream is a pretty empty, disquieting place. With just 1 insight, though, the doll comes to life to level you up, and old Gehrman opens the door to the Hunter's workshop. At 15 insight, you can head to the Cathedral Ward and see the church servants brimming with the corruption of the Great Ones. And at 40 insight, the truth of Yharnam and its healing church and its hunts is revealed. But in order to get the full impact of this reveal, we should take a quick detour through the realm of architecture. From cramped cobblestone streets, pointed arches stretch up to shingled roofs and stone spires silhouetted against a smog-choked sky. In the American psychic landscape, Victorian architecture like Yharnam's is like the visual baseline of horror media. We see big, dark row houses and wrought iron spider webs and immediately draw the connection to haunted mansions, Dracula castles, and the killing grounds of Jack the Ripper. But while Bloodborne uses the dour aesthetic of Victorian architecture as shorthand for horror, it uses the sublime aesthetic of Gothic architecture as shorthand for control. Nowhere is this more clear than in the game's presentation of the Grand Cathedral of the Healing Church, always looming overhead, glaring down at you with its big, baleful eye of stained glass. And if that wasn't heavy-handed enough for you, 2 servants of the Healing Church wait at the cathedral's front door to try and beat you down with enormous hunter runes, basically Bloodborne's version of the crucifix. The Healing Church is the premier medical, economic, and spiritual authority in Yharnam. They have an apparent monopoly over blood healing, which they administer in Yharnam and sell to the sickly wanderers of the world as a miraculous cure-all. The Healing Church itself uses the process as a means of communion with the Great Ones. Of course, imbibing the blood of ancient forgotten gods, whether for health or pleasure or prayer, will inevitably corrupt a person, turn them beastly. And to kill the beasts they've been creating, the Healing Church employs and outfits hunters like you, who themselves are doomed to go beast mode. The Healing Church built this city up from nothing, and created the horrific cyclical system of violence that you and everyone else in Yharnam have been unwittingly trapped within. But, worse than that, they're not even the final, inescapable layer of control. To see that, to see the truth of Yharnam and the hunts, you need 4D insight. All over Yharnam, but notably in the Cathedral Ward, Lovecraftian horrors called amygdalas cling to the sides of church spires with too many arms, and gaze down at the city with too many eyes. At their best, Lovecraft's stories focused on the anxiety of existing in a system that was imposed from above by inscrutable, omnipotent forces which simply have no use for you. The reveal of the amygdalas is not only an exceptionally cool moment of Lovecraftian horror fiction, but by making Kirkland's notion of being subjected to the influence of higher occult powers explicit, it's an exceptionally cool moment of survival horror. You struggle to control the beast within you, and you struggle to take back some control from the Healing Church's debauched social structure, but when you pull the wool away from the eyes inside your head, you can see that there is no freeing yourself from the grand designs of these cosmic horrors. You can rip open the stomachs of as many monsters as you want, and you can enjoy how powerful that makes you feel, but it won't be through any real choice of your own. And it won't help you break free from any of this. I think it's only fitting to end this video where Bloodborne ends. Like all great survival horror games, Bloodborne is linear. No matter what builds you try, what specific route you take, or what side quests you engage with, you and everyone else will see the same handful of story beats and get funneled into one of 3 endings. I've seen these endings referred to as the good, bad, and true endings, but I disagree with that assessment. All 3 endings start the same way. You awaken in the hunter's dream, surrounded by tombstones and lit by the flames that engulf the workshop. Gehrman, your friendly, if creepy, mentor, offers you mercy. If you submit your life to him now, you will awaken on the steps of a dried-up fountain and watch as the morning sun struggles through Yharnam's spiky skyline. This is the good ending, and it's the most ambiguous to me. Was the whole hunt a dream, or just our role in it? The latter seems more likely to me, as both Eileen and Jura claim to be former hunters of the dream. And despite ostensibly accepting Gehrman's offer to awaken, both of these old codgers are still around, still active in Yharnam tonight during this hunt, as they were during the hunt before that and the hunt before that. They face the night with their humanity fully intact now, however fragile that might make them, and surely the same fate will befall you. To get the bad ending, you need to refuse Gehrman's offer. And let's be real, you probably did, because you've been refusing to submit your life to this horrible world for a few dozen hours now. Once you help Gehrman retire, a great one called the Moon Presence makes itself known and forces you to take the old man's place in the wheelchair, as a dutiful assistant to the next crop of hunters. Not only do you not escape the hunts here, you actively cultivate them. The super secret true ending starts the same as the bad ending, but forces you to have devoured and this is real, 3/3 of an Eldritch umbilical cord. This forces a fight with the moon presence, and upon slaying it, you are reborn as a cute little alien slug, who seems to be a newborn Great One. You could argue that this is the best ending. Having transcended the hunt and achieved godhood, your character could throw the status quo of Yharnam into a meat grinder. But, why would they? They have the inscrutable, infinitely vast mind of a Great One now, so who's to say that they won't see Yharnam's cycle of bloodshed in the same positive light as the amygdalas or the moon presence? Who's to say that the Great Ones won't want to produce another child out of Yharnam, or that your character won't want the same? Hell, who's to say that they wouldn't forget all their puny human ambitions and take off for the vast expanse of the cosmos, leaving Yharnam unchanged? Until you, viewer, become an omnipotent being from the furthest reaches of time and space, you don't get to say what this little fella's gonna do. He's so cute, man, I love this little freak. One ending makes you more vulnerable to Yharnam's nightly hunts, one ending shackles you to their continuation, and the final ending sees you personally transcend them. But in none of these endings is Yharnam freed from its blood-drunk cycle of violence. The nightmare swirls and churns, unending. In her 2008 article, Does Survival Horror Really Exist?, I think Lee Alexander perfectly captures the core emotional experience of survival horror. She writes, "You have a sinking feeling that at the end of the next corridor, death is lurking in the shape of a shambling, deformed monster. But you press on through the dispassionate madness, driven by unraveling mysteries and the unresolved ghosts of your own past." The rest of the article mourns the loss of slower, more deliberate, and psychologically driven survival horror games from the AAA space. And I think she's right to do so. The focus on mass market appeal means that the big budget horror game industry, such that it exists, has been monopolized by Resident Evil remake clones. But despite its regrettable diminishment in the AAA space, survival horror isn't dead. This genre doesn't have to exist as just one rigid box. It doesn't have to exist as a specific set of canonized traits with no room for deviation, no consideration for its core emotional experiences. And to treat it like it does would limit your understanding of games that I'm sure you love. Survival horror has evolved with time, and Bloodborne sits at the pinnacle of its evolution. The game's frenetic, bloody, no-holds-barred combat triggers the same reflex-activating power of fear as those mad dashes for safety in the titles of old. The game's narrative compels you forward with a Lovecraftian mystery of eldritch rituals and men gone mad, while its aesthetic evokes horror of both the classic and cosmic variety. And as powerful as it might make you feel, the game never lets you forget that you're not in control. It's the inhuman beast inside of you, threatening to rip you apart from the inside, that relishes the hunt. And it's the Great Ones that planted that beast there in the first place. When you walk away from Yharnam, you should heed the words of Master Wilhelm and fear the old blood.